Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Hello and welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sands, and I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Williams, and we're here to help you make the most of your minerals and royalties. So, Justin, we have an interesting episode lined up today. We were talking before we hit record about all the trials and tribulations of getting into pay status so that you can receive timely royalty payments from your operator. And, this is usually something we deal with when a new well gets drilled, but like we were talking before we hit record, Justin, I know you've been dealing with an issue on a well that was drilled 4 years ago or 3 years ago, and you're still working through the issues.
Yep, you nailed it, Matt. This show today hits close to the heart because this is something that I'm currently going through. And I know many mineral owners face this, and it's not something where you always get a lot of information back from the operator. So you kind of have to research and understand what steps you have in your tool belt to kind of take action.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's what we're going to talk about today is how to take action when you believe that you should be receiving royalties, but you're not. And each of the states that have oil and gas production have laws in place that have certain protections for mineral and royalty owners. Some are a lot stronger than others. And, some are more favorable to operators, some are more favorable to the oil and gas, mineral and royalty owners. But we're going to talk about some of those considerations if you both have a new well that was recently drilled and what is the timeline for when you should start getting paid royalties on that new well, as well as just ongoing issues that maybe you've inherited minerals or royalties or purchased them and you need to get into pay status. In other words, you need to transfer the ownership of that property to get it in your name so you can start receiving royalties. And some similar conditions exist for when operators have to pay you each month. And there are times where you might be owed interest on those past due royalties. And so we'll give you specific examples from some of the major oil and gas producing states. So if you have minerals or royalties in those states, you can know what your rights are and what you need to be aware of in terms of timing. And then some different steps that you can take to get things resolved so you can get paid in a timely manner. To help you with this, because I know this is something, Justin, I've had several clients that have dealt with this. And a big question is, okay, well, what do I do? How do I address this to the operator? What do I say? So we've put together a template, a letter that you can use to send to operators if you have some royalties that are past the due date. And so that you can request the interest that is owed to you if there's interest that might be accrued, or at least to find out what is going on with that interest and is there a title issue or not, and so that you can start getting paid. So that is something, if you go to mineralrightspodcast.com and search for this episode, you'll find a link to download that free letter template that you can use to contact your operator to get into pay status and start getting paid royalties. So before we dive into the details, Justin, I think that it's worth talking about a couple of the basics around the process for when a well gets drilled and some of the time frames that are involved. And I think a lot of times we are kind of hoping, we're anticipating that royalty payment, hoping that it comes really soon, but it actually can take quite a while, both before this well starts producing oil and gas and to where you would be owed royalties.
You nailed it, Matt. And we hear a lot of royalty owners that get caught up in, oh, it's taking so long, it's taking so long. And the truth is that from the time the well gets permitted to drilled and then completed, it has a pretty long time frame. And after that first production and start of flowback, that's when really the operator starts to look at title opinions and start to get the accounting system updated with all of the owners. And Matt, the division order is typically the sign we see from the operator coming to us.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's usually one of the first indications. If we haven't been keeping track of that particular mineral or royalty interest and have noted that perhaps the operator has permitted wells, that maybe they were drilled, that they were completed, and you were kind of monitoring that through the State Oil and Gas Commission website or through software like Mineral IQ or another mineral management software where you're keeping track of your interest and just kind of noting those different milestones that occur in the life of a well, especially a new well. And that's something where you might be surprised. You get a division order in the mail and you're like, oh, what's this for? And then you're trying to figure out, okay, where is this well? What's my decimal interest? All that stuff. So this is an opportunity maybe just to throw out there. If you aren't already kind of proactively managing that stuff, this is maybe a good time to think about. If you're getting paid from operators in EnergyLink already, you can get a free Mineral IQ account that has some basic functionality that allows you to at least keep track of some of the wells. It will notify you when things happen around those wells, like permits and things like that. Then you can identify, oh, there's maybe a new well that was drilled. I need to start figuring out what my decimal interest is going to be in that well, understand the timing. And to Justin's point earlier, you have the different things that happen. The permitting process, it gives the operator usually between 2 to 3 years to actually go and drill the well. So just because a permit gets issued doesn't mean, first of all, that well is ever going to get drilled. But if it does get drilled, it might not be for a couple of years. And then that well may sit there for 6 months to 12 months, a lot of times, before the operator will actually go in and complete it. In other words, frack it and start producing the oil and gas. And that's just because this is kind of an operational thing that they do to have an inventory of well bores that they can keep a frack crew busy continuously so that they can go and complete all of those wells in sequence. And a lot of times it's quicker to complete a series of wells because they can complete a lot of them in parallel, whereas they're drilling them one by one. And so maybe they have a little bit of a time difference between the time that it takes to drill the well to the time that it takes to complete the well. So they want to keep those crews busy as possible. So they may actually hold some inventory of what they call drilled and uncompleted wells, or DUCs. And then once they have a certain number of those, and then they'll go in and then complete it. So you could be looking at maybe a 1 to 4 year period from when a well gets permitted to when it actually starts producing oil and gas. And so that's something to keep in mind. I'm always, anxious when I see a new well gets drilled on my minerals, but then I have to think back to, okay, what state is it in? Even though it started producing, maybe that operator has up to 6 months before they start paying royalties. And so you're kind of waiting for that division order to show up, waiting for that first royalty check, but it can take some time. And they will usually try to bump up against that due date, as far as they can, because that is sort of a free loan on having to pay that money. So basically, that's something to think about. If you have a well that was completed recently, go look at your state statutes to understand the time frame for when they have to start paying you the first payment. So we'll talk a little bit about that here specifically for 3 states. It varies state by state. So if you have interests in New Mexico, Texas, or Oklahoma, we'll talk about that today. But if you have interests in other states, you'll need to go to your state laws and search for royalty payment, oil, gas, interest payments, or something like that, and get a link to those laws. You can read and see what it says for what the operators have to do in your state where you have minerals or royalties. So Justin, do you want to dive into some of those state by state variations? And let's maybe talk first about New Mexico and some of the laws in place around interest on late royalty payments.
Absolutely, Matt. I think we're pretty familiar with hearing the concept of a suspense account. And so in the New Mexico bill here, it says the payer shall create a suspense account on his books for such interest or may interplead the suspended funds into court. And it goes on to say that all persons should be paid and that proceeds from production, payments to others shall not affect other people. And some of the key differences here is it mentions interest. So if the person entitled to payment from suspended funds shall be entitled to interest on the suspended funds from the date payment is due under Section 7010(3) of the New Mexico NMSA. And Matt, with New Mexico, they said that the time frame which you should receive your royalties shall be paid not later than 6 months after the first day of the month following the date of first sell, and then not later than 45 days after the end of the calendar month within which payment is received by the payer for production. And so those set some pretty clear timelines, Matt, and compared to some of the other ones.
Yeah, that's a good point. So the key things to remember there, New Mexico, you have a new well that's drilled. They have 6 months after the first day of the month following the day of first sale. So for example, we'll just throw some arbitrary dates out there. So let's say you have a well that started producing in the middle of July. So what they say is, okay, as of August 1st, that's the first day of the month following the date of the first sale, and then 6 months after that. So you have to start the clock 6 months after August 1st. So even though the well started producing sometime in July, it's really August, September, October, November, December, and then January before they have to start paying you royalties. So you can be waiting until January basically before they need to start paying you. So that's where you need to be aware of those. And that's why I think it pays to be proactive if you have a significant royalty interest, especially, if you're talking a couple $100, it's not a lot of money that it's at stake in terms of the interest that would be due. But if you're talking about tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars, that interest payment can add up pretty quickly. And so that's where you want to be on top of the timing so that as soon as that deadline is reached, and if they haven't paid you by then you can notify them to get those funds that you're legally entitled to into the interest payment as well that you're legally entitled to on those suspended funds that are owed to you. Now, something important to note here is that those interest payments unfortunately aren't going to be paid to you if you have a title defect, if there are questions or disputes on ownership of those interests. And this is just in general across any state. Again, each state will have some specific language as to what the operator has to pay interest on late payments for and what they don't. And in general, what the way to think about that is they're not going to be obligated to make timely payments to you, period, and or even pay interest if there's, again, a title defect, a question about the whereabouts of the payee. So if they tried to pay you and the check got sent back, it got returned to sender, they've made an attempt to pay you, but they couldn't because maybe you didn't leave a forwarding address, you moved, whatever it is. They can then use that as sort of a get out of jail free card in terms of having to pay you interest. And so they'll hold those funds in suspense, waiting for you to contact them to claim those royalties. Because, after a certain period of time, if they can't resolve that payment issue, then the funds will be escheated to the state. In other words, they'll be handed over to the state comptroller to administer going forward. And so that is another place to look if you are owed royalties on a well. It could be there's an ownership issue. Could be that you need to reach out to them and let them know, hey, here's a copy of my deed. I believe I should be getting paid royalties on this well. Here's my contact information. Please let me know what information you need to put me in pay status. And a lot of times they'll say, oh, great. Here's a division order. Here's a W-9 if you haven't already returned one, so we can get your tax ID. And then as soon as they get that information, as soon as they know how to contact you or where to pay that, they'll start sending checks. So that's something to think about. Now, Texas is another one, Justin, that has some pretty robust laws in place that help protect royalty owner rights. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of the timelines there?
Absolutely. So in Texas, oil and gas production are due 120 days after the end of the month of first sell, and then subsequent royalties are payable 60 or 90 days after the end of the month in which production is sold. And again, as Matt mentioned before, operators are not obligated to make these timely payments if there's a title defect or a question about the whereabouts of the payee, or if the royalty owner declines to sign a division order. When a royalty owner with interest in Texas receives that division order, they have to verify the accuracy of their royalty decimal, and that may require reaching out to the operator. And in Texas, division orders, they really have a lot of effect and something that is really on the mineral owner to verify and to work with the operator to figure out that interest is correct.
Yeah, that's a great point. And really, Texas is the only state that has a statutory requirement that you sign a division order and return it to the operator in order to get paid royalties. So if you receive a division order and you have other interests in other states, you're like, yeah, I don't sign division orders just because I don't want to adversely affect my rights, change the language in my lease or anything like that. Well, in Texas, if you don't return that division order, that can be a valid reason for them to not have to pay you those timely payments. So those timelines basically go out the window and those interests are placed into suspense pending the resolution of that division order, and or if there's another issue like we talked about before, if there's a title defect, a question about how to pay you, maybe again they've tried to pay you, the check got returned to sender, kind of a thing. So that's a situation where you would need to be very careful if you have interest in Texas, and you need to first make sure that the royalty interest in that well is correct, your decimal interest in that well matches what you believe you should be getting paid, and you basically need to sign that and return it. And if there's any questions about the language in that division order, a lot of attorneys recommend adding language to the effect of this division order does not amend or adjust any of the terms of an oil and gas lease. There's some legalese you can add in there if it doesn't already include it, that will protect your rights and make sure that the division order is just being used to confirm your decimal interest in those wells, and that you're agreeing to that so that you can be put into pay status, but that you're not agreeing to any additional like terms of warranting your interest or any liability or for payment or anything like that, which they may try to sneak in. And if you have a question about what the division order should include or should not include, we covered division orders in more detail in episode 16. And we have a link in there to the model division order form by the National Association of Division Order Analysts, or NADOA, which is an alternative form that you can sometimes use if you don't like the language that's included in the division order you receive from your operator. So definitely important in Texas to be on top of the division order. You have to sign it and return it in order to get paid royalties. Other states do not require division orders in general. Again, check your state to make sure that you understand the requirements there, and be sure to get with a qualified attorney if you have a question about the language in that, whether or not it's going to affect your rights under your oil and gas lease. Get with an attorney to help navigate those issues. But, Justin, I think Texas is one of the best states in terms of a mineral and royalty owner perspective. Like you mentioned, the 120 days after the end of the month of first sale is really pretty quick after a well starts producing before they have to pay you royalties. So if you have interest in Texas and you've had a well drilled and it's older than 120 days and everything else is fine in terms of, you have marketable title, you have been getting paid on maybe other wells in that same mineral tract, that's a good indication that you need to reach out to ensure that you can start the timeline for them to respond and to pay you those interest payments that might be owed. And Justin, you want to talk a little bit about what this Texas law says around payment of interest and what you need to do to protect those rights?
Yeah, absolutely. And Texas really spells this out more so than a lot of states. But much like New Mexico, the laws say that there is an interest required to be paid if they go past the limits of the time in the previous sections. And the code goes on to say how you're supposed to handle that in the case that the payer has not paid you. And that is that within 30 days after the receipt of the required notice from the payee in which to pay the proceeds or to respond by stating in writing a reasonable cause for non-payment, Matt. And I think the most common way we hear of doing this is sending a certified letter. Emails may not really satisfy this request, but that certified letter, you then have the proof that you delivered this to them and that interest would be due, and also at least a response from the operator as to why they are not paying you if there is a.
Yeah, that's a great point. With certified mail, you get proof of delivery of that letter so you can understand when they received it. And that's when the timeline starts. They have 30 days after receipt of that required notice. And that's that basically letter that you send by certified mail in order to respond to you at least, or to pay you the proceeds due if there's no title issues or no other reason that they are holding those payments in suspense. And Justin and I were talking before we record that we've dealt with this in a couple of different situations where operators sometimes, I think, for whatever reason, I think they're probably trying to do the right thing. Could be that they're just overwhelmed with the workload of those division order analysts, of the accounting staff, and just kind of getting all that stuff through the system in order to get people paid. And a lot of times the squeaky wheel will get the grease. And I think, some of these companies, if you think about Texas, they require that interest be paid after the expiration of those time limits at 2 percentage points above the percentage rate charged by the New York Federal Reserve Bank. And right now, it's actually probably a lot higher than it has been historically over the past 10 years or so. Now you're looking maybe 5-6% or whatever interest due. And so what they could be using that as sort of is a low interest rate loan from an operating perspective. So all oil and gas companies have credit lines that they will use to help pay for the drilling completion of wells and having some buffer from a cash flow point of view. So as they're investing money in different projects and things like that, they have that loan that they use to pay for that. Okay. And a lot of times the interest rates on those loans are higher than what they might owe royalty owners interest on for late payments. So, not saying that this is what your operator is doing, but I could see a case where operators would use those royalty payments as sort of a low interest rate loan and just kind of hold them in suspense, wait to pay them, using that money kind of as a buffer for those ups and downs in terms of cash flow. And then in terms of the squeaky wheel getting the grease, when they receive a certified letter from a mineral interest owner, then they put that at the top of the list to go and get that resolved, get them paid right away. So again, not claiming that that's what is happening in your specific case, but I can see a case being made for that happening just because the interest rates a lot of times in these state laws are pretty low. And if they have a higher interest rate loan that otherwise they would have to be paying, then it makes better financial sense to just sort of slowly work through those issues and get those, the larger interests, especially into pay status, just because they can use that money as sort of a low interest rate loan. So that's something to think about. And I think that's just another reason why you ought to be proactive in managing these things, getting with your attorney if you have a question about timelines or about the steps that need to be taken to protect your rights, because some of these states will have legal fees that will get reimbursed. If you hold them to account and you go to court and you win, then they owe you reasonable attorney's fees as well. So just another reason, I think, to have good representation when you have a significant amount of royalties that are owed to you and you have question about whether interest is due or, the timing for that. Definitely worth getting with your attorney. So Justin, do you want to talk about the last state we're going to go do a little bit of a deep dive on, and that's Oklahoma?
Let's do it, man. So Oklahoma, the proceeds of the sale of the oil and gas shall be paid to the persons legally entitled, commencing not later than 6 months after the date of first sale, and then not later than the last day of the second succeeding month after the end of the month which production was sold. And so, Matt, there's very similar to New Mexico. They've got that 6-month time frame from the completing of that well, and then it looks like last day of it, so about 60 days.
Yeah, so that's like 2 months, like you said, where after they have produced that oil and gas, then the clock will start ticking in terms of them needing to pay you. So again, that's pretty common. Again, we're doing the deep dive on these 3 states. Go to your state laws and understand what the rules are around payment of royalties in your particular state where you own minerals and royalties. But many states, I'd say that Oklahoma and Colorado is another one that's 6 months after the date of first sale. And unfortunately, that's just the law. Whereas in Texas, you have 120 days, which is a lot quicker. It's 4 months. So if you have a well that was just drilled and started producing, and it's been 4 to 6 months after that, and you haven't seen a division order or you haven't seen your first royalty check yet, then definitely do some digging into your state law, understand what that time frame is, and then understand what your rights are around how soon they have to reply to a request for payment. So what you would want to do is send them again a certified letter demanding payment and demonstrating that you're entitled to payment. I think that's the other thing is if you're coming out of the blue saying, hey, you owe me royalties, you need to pay it, they're going to be like, well, who are you? How do we know that you're the right person? If you don't have marketable title, that could be a very good reason why they're not paying you royalties. And we'll talk a little bit more about what you might need to do if that is the case and what marketable title means when we talk about minerals and royalties here. So definitely something to think about. Now, let's talk, Justin, about some of the common timelines and practices and reasons why maybe there might be different timelines than what is outlined in the statute.
Absolutely, man. The first thing to check really is your lease. You got to be sure to read your oil and gas lease and see if there was a different timeline for payment that was set out in the oil and gas lease, or even referring to interest on late payments that may be more or less than what the state sets forward. Title issues are also something that is a pitfall that this can fall into. If it's a situation where ownership wasn't transferred from your ancestor, or maybe there is a title defect in the chain, This can be a reason that they aren't required to be held to those payment timelines. And this is the responsibility of the mineral right owner to be sure to reach out and work through these things. Also, Matt, if the interest is really small, it's possible that the royalties are being held in suspense to hit the minimum payment threshold. And that can be another reason that you're not seeing that check within those time frames. But once it hits that minimum, you should be seeing that.
That's a good point. Now, this is interesting. In the Texas law, it mentions that any delay in determining the person's legally entitled to proceeds from production caused by unmarketable title shall not affect payments to persons whose title is marketable. And I think this is an important concept to talk about. Justin, do you want to talk about what that means? What is that really talking about there? What happens if some of the owners in a mineral tract have marketable title, but then others don't? How does that handled?
Absolutely, man. And it sounds like it would be obscure, but this is probably really not very uncommon at all. And this would be when you have those interests in that same mineral tract, there can be some of those fractional interests that the lineage is correctly documented, the chain of title is recorded within the county, but then there may be others that have title defects, and title defects being maybe the ownership hasn't been changed. Maybe there was a question as to how those interests were actually split up in an estate, and maybe the asset didn't go through probate and get properly distributed to the heirs. And Matt, it's so common. We talk about this all the time with mineral right owners. And so those timelines, Matt, that we talk about, they really assume that there's no title disputes between the owners and there's a nice, clean, marketable title to the mineral owner. And Matt, in my case, I've always had questions come up about the chain of title. And that's something I've often dealt with is I have to really reach out and be proactive about it to get that title dispute or the title defect cleared up. And I now have that set of paperwork that always answers the questions. And I just kind of know how to go through that. But it was certainly a challenge the first time.
Yeah, it can be a challenge. And it's certainly something where, and I guess the good thing about what Justin just mentioned is that if you have marketable title, so let's just give a hypothetical example. Your interest, your grandparents owned your interest. They gave half of it to your uncle and half to your father or mother, and you inherited your portion from your father and mother. Their estate went through probate. You have marketable title. In other words, the interest is in your name, so you have a deed that conveyed those interests to you. But maybe your cousins, the interests are still in their parents' name, and they haven't gone through probate. They haven't gotten those interests conveyed to them. Because of that title defect and the lack of marketable title with your cousins, the operator can't use that as justification for not paying you what you're owed. So that's, I guess, the silver lining to all of this is if you've gone through the trouble of getting your stuff into your name and getting all title defects resolved, then the operator is obligated to pay you, even if it's the same mineral tract and there's other owners that don't have marketable title. Now, there is one exception to that is, that assumes there's no title disputes between the owners in that same tract. So if you, on the other hand, if you had an issue where you had marketable title, your cousins, maybe even if they didn't, but there is a dispute, they say, nope, you don't own what you purport to own. We believe we own more, and here's why. And if the operator is notified of this, and they'll put all of those interests in suspense pending the resolution of that dispute. And so that is something to keep in mind, is there can be an issue if somebody contacts the operator, says, hey, hold on a second, here's some additional information and why we think that we actually should be getting paid on that interest or paid more than we are currently getting paid or whatever. So that's one case where the operator also sort of suspends those timelines. And that's a valid reason for the operator to not be paying royalties, is if there's a title dispute. Now, again, this is all stuff that you can address by contacting the operator and finding out why you're not getting paid. If you're waiting for payment, that timeline expires, that's an immediate reason to contact them and say, hey, I own these interests. Believe I should be getting paid. Please advise what I need to do to get into pay status. And they may say, oh, yeah, we need you to sign a stipulation of interest and cross conveyance. There's a title dispute on this tract. We're going to need all of the affected mineral interest owners to sign this to agree going forward who should be getting paid what in order to start paying you again. So that is a potential outcome. And again, if you have any sort of title disputes, any issues with not having marketable title, in other words, having title defects, get with a qualified attorney. They can help you file the appropriate paperwork. Maybe that it means going through a determination of heirship. Maybe it means filing ancillary probate in the state where the minerals are located. And so that is another very common situation where maybe you've inherited minerals and other assets from a relative. They died in one state and they went through probate in that state, and you got things, conveyed to you from that state. But what you need to do is actually file probate in the state where those minerals are located in order to get that marketable title, in order to demonstrate that you are the correct owner. And then you need to have a deed recorded in the county, or an assignment document recorded in the county where those interests are located, in order to get that all cleared up. So that is something that is very common as well.
Absolutely, man. And another thing that royalty owners fall into is the statute of limitations on royalty interest owed. And each state kind of set this forward, but in Texas, for instance, I believe it's 4 years that you look back, and any royalty interest owned before that time period set out in the statute of limitations, it's really hard to recoup that from either previous operators or the current operator. And so this is just another reason it's really important for mineral owners to keep an eye on their portfolio, so that they can see these problems and that they don't go too long, so that you are unable to recover that money.
Yeah, what Justin's referring to is those interest payments. So if you have, sort of interest that might be owed, you need to be aware of the timing for claiming that. And then, because if there is a statute of limitation, that could be something you run up against. In general, though, if they have an issue, they're going to hold that in suspense until that is resolved. And again, one other outcome is if they can't pay your relative, maybe they pass away, they keep trying to pay them royalty payments, they're going to, at some point in time, after a certain threshold time period gets met, they'll hand that over to the state to administer going forward. So you still would have ownership of those past due royalties, so to speak, but you would have to go through the process of claiming them from the state if they get escheated to the state. In other words, if they get handed over to the state to administer going forward. And so that is definitely a common situation as well. If you have some interest that you find out about down the road that maybe you didn't know about, and there are some producing wells and that have been paying royalties for some time, and your ancestor passed away many years ago, then that is very possible that you have some missing money that's out there, and you could just go to the state comptroller where the interests are located or where the relative lived and search for their name, and you can see if there's anything out there. So that's definitely a worthwhile thing to do as well. So, those are some of the challenges and some of the issues and reasons why you might not be getting paid, and what to do about it. Now, there are some ways that you can use technology to help streamline the process for managing your royalty payments, to notify you when you get new wells drilled or when these major events occur, so that you can then proactively identify them and contact the operators. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and some of the reasons as well that that are valid reasons why you might see a drop off in production or a drop off in payments?
Yeah, absolutely. So well maintenance is, I think, one of the most common. The well is shut in for maintenance. For example, if the pump jack's used, maybe a parted rod or wax buildup that needs to be flushed out, that could cause that production to stop until the operator addresses the issue. It could be an accounting issue. This isn't terribly common, but it can happen. Maybe the operator is switching over accounting systems and maybe something changed on that end. And then, like we mentioned before, the payments being below the minimum threshold for the month, especially as production declines, your royalty checks will continue to get smaller from that well. And as the wells get older, your royalty payments get smaller. And it's certainly possible that you're barely meeting that payment threshold, or you're not meeting the payment threshold, receive those payments. And depending on how the state sets that out in its statutes, you may receive checks every other month, every 3 months. It really depends. And typically, for example, in Oklahoma, if the proceeds are less than 100 and you haven't requested monthly payments for amounts above 25, you may not see monthly checks.
Yeah, that's a great point. And Oklahoma has some very specific timelines outlined. So we'll link to the state statutes so you can check that out. But, that is a very common reason as well. And that's another reason when you receive a division order, and especially in a state where you aren't required to return it, they may have in there a minimum payment threshold of $100 in order for them to pay you. And so they'll just hold those funds in suspense, and you wouldn't be owed interest on that. It's just part of the timeline for those funds reaching that minimum payment threshold, and they'll cut a check. And I have a couple of small interests in Oklahoma. And if you request to be paid monthly for anything above $25, or to be paid annually if you have anything that's under $10. So $10 is like the minimum they'll pay you annually. For anything above 10 but less than 100, they'll pay you that every year. And if you want those payments sooner than that, you need to let them know. And usually when you get a division order, it'll have in there the time frame for when you'll get paid. You can just cross out whatever they have if it's above $25 and just write in anything more than $25 will get paid monthly. And so that's one way that you can ensure to get paid as soon as possible for any royalties that you're owed. But again, if they're very small interest, as these things decline over time, it's possible that you were receiving payments on a monthly basis because it was more than $100. And then it went below that $100 threshold, and then it's just accumulating each month until it reaches that payment threshold, in which time they'll cut you a check. And so like Justin said, that could be every 3 months, 6 months, 7 months, just depends. And in that situation, you could notify the operator to pay you if it's above that minimum payment threshold in your state. So definitely check out your state laws. And if you have the opportunity, you might as well get paid sooner if possible. So that's definitely something to think about as well. So those are some common reasons why you might not be getting paid that are totally valid. Again, you can use mineral management software like Mineral IQ to help you keep track of those monthly payments. And, it'll show you each month that you get paid from that operator. If you were getting paid every month for a while and then you see it drop off for a month and then you are wondering why, you can dig into the well status. You might look and see, like Justin mentioned earlier, it could be that they're doing well maintenance and that well was shut in for that month and it wasn't producing, or they didn't sell any oil or gas for that month. And so that could be a reason. And again, just knowing how to navigate the State Oil and Gas Commission website, or, if you're using Mineral IQ, you can go to that well and look at the status of the well, and it might show that it's shut in. So those are some things you can do to stay on top of it if you notice a payment that is missed for a particular month. And so that's just another reason to stay on top of those royalty payments on a monthly basis. And, again, we'll have some links to Mineral IQ if you don't have an account and you're getting checks from Energy Link. It's a great resource. They have a free plan as well as a paid plan, and definitely something that I use. And if you at least recommend using the free plan, to check that out as an option. And again, we'll have links to in the show notes to a form letter you can use to send to your operator if you want to notify the operator that you are owed some interest or owed payment on some royalties. Definitely something you can use. And again, get with your attorney if there's some specific situations that you need to address that may not be covered by that letter. But this is something just as a free informational resource. Check that out. And then also, if you're wanting to get more proactive, want to understand how do you go and check the State Oil and Gas Commission website, how do you identify where that interest is located, what the well status is, those kinds of things. That's all covered in my course, Mineral Management Basics. If you go to mineralrightspodcast.com/courses, you can find out more about that as well. So that wraps up this episode. And again, be sure to stay on top of when you should be getting paid royalties. You might be owed interest, and you would need to let the operator know so that you can claim that interest. Otherwise, they may just hold on to that payment until the squeaky wheel gets the grease. If you're wanting to get paid sooner than later, be sure to be proactive in reaching out.
Absolutely, Matt. Yep. It's hugely important to stay on top of that. And it's getting easier than ever with all the technology that's available to us to do so.
Absolutely. Well, that wraps up this episode. Thanks again for listening. Thanks, Justin.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks so much for listening to the Mineral Rights Podcast with your host, Matt Sands. Don't forget to subscribe and share at mineralrightspodcast.com. The Mineral Rights Podcast should not be construed as investment, legal, or tax advice. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy.